Welcome to Beaconsfield Podcast. It's a great honor for me today to be speaking with John Dunn. John Dunn is Emeritus Professor of Political Theory at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge. He's one of three founders of the Cambridge School of Intellectual History at King's College, and his imagination has reached across a range of issues in history and political thought. His books include The Political Thought of John Locke, Modern Revolutions, Western Political Theory in Face of the Future, The Cunning of Unreason, and Setting the People Free. And today, John and I are going to be speaking about a recent trend in intellectual history towards the global. John wrote an article in 2018 called Why We Need a Global History of Political Thought. And it's in the spirit of that paper that we're gathered here today to speak. So thank you so much, John, for coming on the podcast.
Pleasure.
John, I want to take a step back and go back to your childhood and to apply your approach to yourself, if you like, and take a contextualist view. What has your long-standing relationship been with the global? You grew up in post-war Germany, Iran, and India. How did those early experiences inform your thinking about the global as a stage for making sense of politics, if you like?
Well, of course, I did grow up in Britain too. So you need a fourth place. But it is right that those three experiences did have a big effect on me cumulatively. I was a child in Germany. My father was an army officer in the Army of Occupation. And as a child, I wandered through the woods with abandoned machine guns and sort of mine casings and very exciting things for a small boy. Not entirely reassuring for my mother, but I also saw the ruins of Hamburg, and I didn't forget those completely. They didn't haunt me. I didn't forget them. So I didn't think of the Second World War even after Britain had mysteriously come out on the right side of it. I didn't think of it as sort of irrelevant to life. But the two places which I went to later on in life for different reasons are both connected with my father's work, but when he had shifted over rather unsuitably into a diplomatic role in the British Embassy in Tehran at the time when the oil fields were nationalized, and his primary personal responsibility was to try to see whether it would be possible to raise the Iranian army against Dr. Mossadegh, the nationalist leader who had retaken the oil fields for their own country. I mean, my father obviously didn't talk to me about that aspect of what he was doing at the time, but there's plenty of evidence about it in the British public records. So it's a known piece of history, really. And the coup which got rid of Dr. Mossadegh was set up by someone whom my father cooperated with. And it was set up, obviously, through a process which involved the other intelligence people in the embassy. And the most senior of those two senior people, actually. One was Monty Woodhouse, who'd been leader of the British operation in Greece during the war against the Greek communists, and presumably also against the Nazis. But I think the Greek communists were very prominent in what he was up to, and he was the MI5 person in the embassy, and he was subsequently director of Chatham House and Tory junior minister of foreign affairs. And the senior person was the chargé d'affaires in the embassy, and he subsequently became the deputy high commissioner in the embassy in the High Commission in India, which is why my father went on to there afterwards. Anyway, that's just putting a bit of context. I mean, I can't say that at the time Iran struck me in any way except by its extreme poverty, juxtaposed to the extreme riches of a very small number of people with whom I sort of more directly interacted with their children anyway. I did go on thinking from then on. I was 13 years old the last time I was there. I had my 30th birthday there. So I went on thinking from that, but I particularly went on, I was in India, in New Delhi, for over a year, in fact, in mid-adolescence for a variety of reasons which aren't pertinent. We traveled quite a lot outside Delhi. Delhi was a beautiful place to live in at that point. It was a pampered expatriate, fantastically beautiful place to live. And maybe less than a tenth of its current size. But we drove out a lot into the country for the reasons, again, which aren't relevant, but we did. And so I saw a very large number of Indian peasants, and I was startled, really, by quite how poor they very obviously were, by how extremely thin they were, and on average, how small they were. There was at one point when I was there when the river Jamna, which runs through Delhi, roughly speaking, flooded badly, and there were a lot of refugees in, and some of them were sleeping outside in the streets, and even in the diplomatic enclave. Any of them might actually have sort of died during the night. So I got a sense of the extremity of the contrast in life chances between human populations. And because I wasn't really doing anything else except being with my parents, I didn't really have anything in the way of education for over a year. I thought quite a lot while I was there, and I went on thinking quite hard from that experience subsequently. So I came to Cambridge as an undergraduate by accident, really, and somewhat against my will. I came to Cambridge already very preoccupied by the grotesque injustice of the distribution of human life chances across the world. And in Cambridge, as undergraduates quite often do, I started to try to work out what my own political views were. And I had lots of close friends who were interested in politics, some, of course, who weren't as well. And amongst my closer friends who was interested in politics was the son of Harry Pollitt, the most, I think, effective leader of the British Communist Party. So I had a range of views, as it were, put to me, and I was trying to think about what to do about the grotesque disparity in human life chances across the globe. And I thought about British politics. Obviously, I was interested in that too. I thought about that from that angle, and I was always more interested really in that than in the distribution of life chances inside the United Kingdom. Not practically more interested, because I obviously am a British citizen. A minuscule weight that a British citizen can have in the politics of the United Kingdom, unless they squander their life on trying to have more. I don't think there's a reason to believe I could have much increased my impact if I had squandered my life that way. But anyway, I didn't choose to do that. But I sort of auditioned what looked like the range of options put to me at the time about what was a good approach to politics, I auditioned them really against the disparity of human life chances across the globe. So, and in a sense, I've just always gone on from there. And I thought it would be quite easy to see what sort of political judgments and commitments and opinions you should have, and what you should therefore do, as it were, in relation to politics. But this turned out not to be true. And so I've been thinking about that ever since. And for most of my career as a teacher in the university, trying to show other much younger people how to do so.
So you were interested, John, before you got to Cambridge, and indeed at Cambridge, in the question, what is to be done in politics? But you read the history tripos at Cambridge. Of course, politics wasn't offered at the time within Cambridge. But, why did you choose to study history at Cambridge rather than do the PPE, for example, at Oxford? Why move to history as the domain for asking these questions about politics?
Well, this is a lot of accident in these things. I mean, as I said, I didn't mean to come to Cambridge, so I wouldn't have chosen either. And I would have chosen to read history somewhere else. But anyway, I was going to go to Keele because that had a sort of recuperative first year. And I hadn't done any natural science at all. I'd done one term of the history of chemistry and one term of the history of physics. So I was just about up to Newton and Lavoisier. But apart from that, I was completely ingenuous about how nature worked, if you want to call it nature, the universe. Anyway, I was ingenuous about how anything worked, really. And I just thought this is ridiculous. I mean, to start off adult life on this basis, partly because of the year plus in India, when I wasn't doing anything, but it wasn't only that. Anyway, I would have gone to Keele. That's where I was aiming for. But my school, I was at a British boarding school, a very unmeritorious British boarding school, and the school was very competitive, mostly in sport. It was extremely competitive in sport. One of my contemporaries was a dual gold medal winner in the Olympics. But anyway, it was very competitive in sport. It wasn't very competitive in anything on the cognitive side. And it wanted me to win a prize. And it said, so I could go to Keele if I was ass enough to do so. But before that, I had to take the scholarship exam. It was at King's and Balliol. And King's came first. Okay. And I got a scholarship to King's. Now, if Balliol had come first, I expect I would have read PPE. I mean, why not? But anyway, I didn't.
And following John, one of the really interesting things about your biography is that in the 70s, you spent time in Ghana, in Africa. I was wondering if you could tell us about, particularly with this global view in mind, how Africa shaped your imagination on these political questions when you were in Ghana, and writing about Ghana too, producing works there and on Ghana.
Okay, well, that is a good question from what you want to understand. I mean, I'd finished the historical work I was supposed to do for my PhD, which I never got. And I switched to doing the PhD on something rather different. And I wrote I wrote a dissertation for a PhD about the political thought of law. I submitted it to the Cambridge University Press at the same time as to the examiners. And the examiners had a quarrel about it. And one wished to fail me, and the other wished to give me a PhD. And the one who wanted to give me a PhD was Michael Oakeshott, so he didn't give ground. Anyway, no, neither the other examiner who wanted to fail me gave ground. Anyway, it doesn't matter who they were. But what does matter is that the sort of tiebreaker who the faculty eventually sort of wheeled into place then had a protracted psychotic episode, and so couldn't examine for quite a long time. And having submitted it, I took up a special opportunity that accrued to me as a Fellow of King's, which is that the Vice Chancellor of Ghana University had been a classics PhD at King's, and he came to King's and as the grand African potentate that he had become, and to which, in a sense, King's had contributed to his becoming. And he said, any fellow of the college can come and teach at my university for a year. And I, at that point, had been thinking that I really wanted to work on the politics of the present rather than on history. And I didn't have a permanent job in Cambridge, but I had a job in Cambridge which I could sort of game for a bit by threatening to leave it. So the college had to decide whether or not I had to leave it at that point, if I was to go off to Ghana to teach, or whether I could intermit for a year. And it said I could intermit for a year. So I went to teach the University of Ghana, and I did a piece of research with an anthropologist from Cambridge on the development of rural Ghana from before colonial rule through colonial rule and out the other side, and into actually a contested election, like the first one it had after the fall of Nkrumah. Why did I go to Ghana? Why did I want to go anywhere like that? I wanted to go to Ghana because I wanted to, since that was where I could get to, because I wanted to think about post-colonial states. I was interested in politics, and I suppose I was quite theoretically interested in politics, and I thought, here is a new category of which there are a very large number of instances, and American political scientists were writing about them at the time, Armand and Verber, David Apter, and so on. And I thought, well, what these people are writing is just rubbish. It's not about anything real at all. It's about something that went on in the head of talk at Parsons. It's completely unreal. But actually, it really must make a political difference that these state structures have been built for colonial rule and are now open to appropriation by others for post-colonial rule. And I thought, there's really something to think about in that, and something which really matters. But if I'm going to think about it to any consequence beyond the thought that what these American political scientists are saying about it is pretty complete rubbish, really, I must actually go and find out what's going on in one of them, what is real. I mean, I thought, this is a very, very porous sociological categories, chasing, as it were, more or less completely elusive data. So I thought, that's not going to work. So I thought, well, what would be like to actually have some less elusive, for example, some personal perceptual beliefs about what was going on. So that's why I went. And it was very instructive in all sorts of ways. And Ghana was, all sorts of things happened to me there, but again, don't matter. But I mean, the two things which really do matter for your purposes are that Ghana was a very, very attractive society in many ways. And it was possible there for me to, in a way, to be close to people right across the class structure in a way I've never really been anywhere else in my life. So I did have it is a very, as societies go, cheerful society, Ghana. It's a very accessible society from a foreigner's point of view. Don't think Suella Braverman. So anyway, it's I got very, very involved with it. I
Yeah.
lived in a village for a bit,
Mm.
for some months, and I taught in the university, and so I had a very distinctive sense of it as a place, and I was very attached to it. Yes, 3 years after I went back to Britain, I went back to Ghana a couple of times after that.
Right.
The first time, the year after I'd returned to Britain, and the second time after the government had changed in a military coup. And the new military government was a really abominable government. It was very, very brutal and very, very thievish, and it completely wrecked the country from right across the class structure, except for those inside in the take, as it were, at the very middle, its own sort of personal clients. And it ruined the lives of lots of people I was close to, and I just couldn't take it, really. So I thought I can't go on working on African politics. It's beyond me. It's not within my existential resources. So I stopped working. I didn't completely stop working on African politics at all, but I stopped working on Ghana on a proper sort of participant basis, which is the basis I had been working before. So what effect did all that have on me? Yes. It obviously had an effect on how I thought about post-colonial states. It sort of rather galvanized the interest, but it also changed, in a way, I suppose, the way I felt about politics, because in my sort of UK student auditioning, as it were, posture, I thought about politics as the question of what to do to sort of optimize on local arrangements, principally. And I hadn't thought it was likely I could make a personal causal contribution to repairing the injustice of the distribution of life chances right across the world. But I thought I might be able to sort of pitch in in the right team, if you see what I mean, domestically. So I thought about it in a sort of meliorist and not very optimistic after a bit of thinking, but anyway, sort of non-despairing way. And what the experience of Ghana showed me, really, was, and by how the chickens have come home to roost now, I mean, you can see this in the United Kingdom if you look out of the window, how thoroughly politics can ruin a country.
Yeah.
I just thought this is a very much grimmer subject matter than I'd initially supposed. I didn't feel that it was a subject matter where the stakes were, at all blithe in the first place, as I've tried to explain. But I did think, the stakes are just, the damage limitation frontier is very, very frightening. So if you asked just to put it facetiously, if you asked where the cunning of unreason came from, I would say, well, the sort of the trajectory towards that title probably came from Ghana.
I see.
Because rather, it isn't about Ghana at all, the book, it's about Britain. But I just think I was more open to just trying to work out how grim things are.
Yes.
Because of this. It was a sort of wake-up experience.
Yes. That's extremely interesting, John, because I think one of the very fascinating things about your thought on the global is that there is this wonderful interaction between historicity, in the sense of almost the ethical drive to understand others on their terms and in their context, and then at the same time yet to have a form of political thinking that faces the future, that is future oriented. And I wonder if we can speak about the impact then of Japan on your thought, because one of the themes that I've been thinking about this week, as you raised to me, is this idea of invasion and habitation, home, territory, displacement, and seizure. When did that aspect of the difficulty of politics sort of register your thinking on a global scale, and how did Japan feed into that for you?
Well, I suppose it's quite technical in a way, the impact of thinking about Japan for me, because I mean, the sort of substantive aspect of it was very much there um, from Ghana, and I didn't I'd come back from Japan, um, sorry, from Ghana, at the point where I first met one of the Japanese scholars who actually, in the end, took me to Japan. And so I wasn't particularly thinking about Japan then. And I wasn't thinking about Japan very hard, really, until I actually went there in the early 1980s for the first time. But I did form very close intellectual friendships with a couple of Japanese scholars. And they took me to Japan eventually in the early 1980s. I mean, one of them spent 2 whole years in Cambridge working with me on the political thought of Locke, and a very, very fine scholar, deep scholar, with also an intense interest in the politics of the world now. So someone sort of soulmate, really.
Who was that? Who was the person that you're speaking of?
Well, that was the secondary of the 2 Japanese scholars I became really close friends with. He's called Takashi Kato. He's retired now. But at the time that he came to spend 2 years studying Locke with me, he'd already published his first book, which was about Spinoza. And since then, he's translated Locke's 2 treatises and Hobbes's Leviathan, obviously retranslated the second. And he has written at least a dozen books about more contemporary politics, and he's written other books about Locke and about Spinoza. I mean, he is a very remarkable person. But the first Japanese scholar I knew really well was a man called Takamaro Hadzawa. And he was a bit older, and he was in Cambridge. Had been in Cambridge for at least a year beforehand, perhaps longer than that, at the time that we met. And we met because my first book, The Political Thought of John Locke, had just been published. And he was, I think, a visiting scholar at Jesus College, and he was in Cambridge, also doing a piece of translating Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, I think for the first time into Japanese. And he went to see Raymond Williams. And Raymond Williams, I mean, you can see why, Culture and Society. He went to see Raymond Williams, and Raymond said that he should look me out. So, because of the Political Thought of John Locke having just been published, so he did look me out. And we had a long and interesting conversation. And then he came back a little bit later, about a couple of years later, I suppose, and we started a very elaborate series of conversations. He's a very fine, he's very old now, and not terribly well. But I mean, he and Takashi Kato, between them, took me to Japan and introduced me to, in a sense, the sort of apex of Japanese history of political thought. The 2 professors at the University of Tokyo Law Faculty, one of whom was Maruyama Masao, probably the most famous post-war Japanese political intellectual, and the other was Fukuda Kanichi.
Mm.
And Maruyama was the professor of history of Japanese political thought, and Fukuda was the professor of history of Western political thought. And they'd both been sort of given their mission at a crucial moment in the history of the Pacific War, when the then rector of the University of Tokyo. Japanese intellectual life is very, very hierarchical.
Right.
And the University of Tokyo law faculty was at the very, very top of the hierarchy. But anyway, the rector, who was a historian of political thought, actually, the rector was a man called Shigeru Nambara. And he called his two star students in immediately after Pearl Harbor. And he said to them, we've completely blown this. And it's going to be your life's work to work out why we've so completely blown it.
Wow.
Just what's made that possible.
Wow.
And after the war was over, they did. And I mean, they set about trying to. And you can see Maruyama's work as being obviously set by that way. Fukuda's work, very little available in English, almost none. But anyway, they were both wonderful people. I only met Maruyama once, but I spent a long afternoon and evening with them both at the house of my friend Hansawa, and talking, and I've gone on from there, and I saw Fukuda quite often subsequently.
And
yes,
of course, in 1979, John, you then write Western Political Theory in Face of the Future. And, the effects of this sort of globalizing moment can be felt on your thought in that book, which is about saying, as I understand it, that the concepts which we have inherited in the West are frail and unable to rise to the tasks of our time. Was that book a self-consciously global political theory project for you, or was it doing something else?
It wasn't a project for me. It was an accident. I'll tell you how it happened. I wrote it as a book at all. I didn't actually write it as a book. I wrote it as a set of 4 lectures because I was asked to go to a university in Canada for a week to show off, if you see what I mean, in the way people are sometimes. I was still relatively young, so it was really nice. And there was money involved, not a lot, but enough to be, encouraging. Anyway, I had to give 4 lectures. And I thought, well, I can't give 4 lectures on rock. I'll give a lecture on rock as well. For anyone who happens to be interested, but probably I didn't assume there'd be massive interest. It was in Vancouver, University of British Columbia. But anyway, I thought, well, what am I going to give these lectures on? And I thought I'd given a few years before, probably a couple of years before, I'd given a series of lunchtime talks at the Architectural Association, which was the sort of really snobby architects training place in London town, very small. And I'd been asked to do that by 2 people from the philosophy department at University College, which was just next door to the AA. And the 2 people in question were Richard Volheim and Miles Burnwood. So they were, serious figures. And they said, would I come and give 3 talks at lunchtime about topics assigned to me? And the topics assigned to me were democracy, liberalism, and nationalism. So I took out my note cards and I wrote some stuff on the note cards, and I went and talked to the architects, young architects. It was a very nice occasion. And I put the note cards away. I didn't tear them up or throw them away, but I put them away. And then I thought, well, actually, what I mean, I just thought about their subjects, and I thought, well, actually, it was interesting thinking about those subjects. So, and those talks went quite well. So maybe I can turn those into lectures. And then I thought, well, I've got to have four. Three is insufficient. And I didn't have any other assigned tasks. So I thought, well, what else? Well, I at that point, I had published a book about revolutions. That was another accident. But anyway, that was a publishing success. So lots of copies. And you've got translators. The only work of mine has ever been translated into German, yes, published by a very fancy German publisher, too, and so reviewed in all the German papers. Anyway, I thought about revolution, connectable with my interests in politics, unsurprisingly. Yes. Harry Pollitt's son and so on. Yes, J.D. Bernal's son, too. I'd run a seminar about revolutions with Martin Bernal, who was at that point, a professional historian, very early stage professional historian of China, before he moved on to Black Athena. Yes. Anyway, I thought, well, the fourth one would be on revolution, because I can write about that. I really have thought about that quite a lot, really. So I wrote them out as lectures. I wrote out the texts. I went and gave them. And my host at the UBC said, well, actually, you ought to publish these. They were really quite interesting. And he said, well, I'll get the University of British Columbia Press to publish them. And the University of British Columbia Press said, well, thank you very much for the offer, but on the whole, no. So I thought at that point, well, I had this friend at Cambridge University Press who had actually secured the publication of the 3 books I'd already published. And it was very nice working with her. Because the Revolutions book had really been a publishing success. I mean, by the standards of Cambridge at the time, and it wasn't up to the Bible, of course, but it really had sold copies. They were quite keen on the idea, and she read it, and she said, "Yeah, this is great. Let's publish it." So they did publish it, and I didn't, of course, give the lectures the same title as I gave the book. I can't remember what title I gave the lectures, but I didn't. Maybe they didn't even really have a title, but it must have had some title. But anyway, I don't know. But I thought a bit about the title when I had to put them together properly as a book, and they had a preface, obviously, as a book in a way they didn't have as lectures, couldn't have had as lectures. And I thought, well, oh dear, no, that's all right. I thought, well, I mean, what you should infer from these 3 ways of looking at these, rather contingently incurred categories, is that actually we have very much less grip than we like to assume. And this is sort of pertinent to PPE, I think. I mean, I felt, what is it? I thought, Cambridge, it's the history happened. These people actually lived lives. They wrote for reasons. It wasn't just seminar papers. When it actually happened. And so you probably need to think about it differently to get it right. And PPE doesn't seem to be encouraging people to do that. So, but when I thought, well, what is it that I understand, which, as it were, my very definitely in many cases abler Oxford colleges who had the misfortune to read PPE, what is it that I understand that they don't? I thought, well, actually, what I think I understand that they don't is that they're quite wrong to be as confident about the way they think about politics as they are.
Yes.
They're just hopelessly wrong about it. They just don't get it.
Yes.
So, yes, so Western political theory in the face of the future.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
thought the future is going to come,
Mm. Mm.
and it's going to show up a lot.
So it's very interesting, Dunn, then, that your take to Western political theory in face of the future was almost consistent, or was, with the original intention behind the Cambridge School, was to actually interrogate the fact that thinkers were doing the work here. Human beings in their frailties were having frail thoughts which they were producing, and which weren't quite enough to really grip onto the moment that they were in. Is that a fair assessment to make, that there was a link between your early historicist work and the way you took to theory in that book?
I think they were completely consistent. I don't
Mm.
think that just recognizing the historicity of thought necessarily makes you particularly sensitive to the precariousness of politics, but it certainly doesn't impede your being sensitive to it. So, yeah, I mean, of course, the way I like to think of it is, look, I've got so much better visibility than other people have. Um, but it is something to do with looking in more than one direction.
Yes, I see. I see. Another really interesting thing that you mentioned to me in correspondence was that that book had two covers. So I have the cover with the brawl on the front, but there were two covers that almost were stages on Thought's way, as you said to me, towards the global. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the second time it was published in a series, a small paperback series, smaller paperback series by CUP of works which had sort of sold respectably,
Mm.
as opposed to being issued, um, and landed in the copyright libraries and so on. So I needed a new cover. I mean, the old cover was unsuitable for this series, definitely. And I thought, well, what do I think really should be on the cover of Western political theory in the face of the future? And I was sort of fairly ecologically, distressed
Mm.
from a lot earlier on because of sort of family susceptibilities, I suppose. I thought, well, actually, the world is being ruined, and I need a photograph of the ruin in progress. That would be a good thing to have on the cover. So what is on the cover is a picture of a bit of the Amazon in flames, and it came out in 1993, so 30 years ago. But again, I think that cover has worn well.
Yes, and this walks us towards this global moment now. So 2018, you released the article "Why We Need a Global History of Political Thought." Would you be able to explain to us, John, why you think we do need such a thought, and why now, and how you think we might begin to go about attempting to construct it?
Well, the third is a real killer of a question. I'll
Yes.
leave that till later. Why does it need it? Well, it needs it, as it were, epistemically, and it needs it politically, I would say. It needs it epistemically because the history of political thinking is no longer, in factual terms, parochial, because it spreads all the time and in every direction across the borders of parishes. I mean, back to why Japan has mattered to me. I mean, this has been going on for some time. And you could say, well, it's been going on for some time at a high thought level, but it's going on the whole time now in a way which is, if you could track it properly, is absolutely indisputably global.
Yeah.
Nowhere is sealed off. Everywhere is, leaking into everywhere else. Well, not obviously, everywhere isn't leaking into everywhere, but from everywhere there are leaks, and into everywhere there are leaks. And the leaks are big leaks, they're not small leaks. So I thought, if you want to see what's going on, that's what is going on. And it has been going on for a long, long time. But actually, if you open if you look at the front page of a serious newspaper now, there it is, all over the front page. It'll be all over, quite a lot of the subsequent pages too, if it's any decent newspaper. I mean, there's just a lot going on interactively across the world. And since it's, all humans doing stuff, and since humans think, they can't help noticing that some of the other humans they're interacting with think differently. And they have to, that is something which they politically need to learn to handle. It's not as though they find it effortless to handle one another inside the village. But the further they have to stretch their interactions, the tougher it gets. So on the front page of the Times, I think it is today, there's a headline which says, Netanyahu criticizes Putin for demanding ceasefire in Gaza.
Yes.
There's a lot of leak there.
Yeah, right. Yes.
So, politically, we have to do a great deal better. Well, you could say, well, sort of, the damage limitation has to be done at the top of states. And people at the top of states are the people who most need this education, be educated to the global character of the political. But you could also say, well, actually, I teach in what is still a very good university. I teach lots of very clever people. I'm supposed to be teaching them how to think about politics. I don't think it could be said in good faith that actually the university is much good at teaching them how to think about politics. I mean, it's not so catastrophically bad, but it hasn't, as it were, risen to the challenge of the global as yet. Very optimistically, I mean, some people from here may go off and be the people who have to, field the challenge of the global in the first instance in a way which is politically consequential. I just really have to try to educate the people who are going to have to cope. So it's very, very urgent, this. And you have to say, well, it's extraordinary how, parochial and naive actually the global political elites are now. They're just, it's not just that they're slightly behind the curve. I mean, they just haven't really got a clue for the most part. And even those who are sort of most look as though they have traces of sophistication and had plenty of traces of the parish too. I mean, it's partly performative, you might think, of the sophistication, but if you take an example of a sort of high performativity global elite person, President Macron, very, very elegant rhetorically, extremely French, liable to make really catastrophic mistakes in handling the global because of handling them as though they were a sort of class in the now disbanded École Nationale d'Administration. I mean, just, yeah.
So if the need to address this epistemic wound, as you describe it in your article, John, is a political call that matters for the world and wider humanity, what role do intellectual historians have to play in going about constructing that history? And to come back to the previous big frightening question that I raised before, how do we go about actually trying to put this together in the academy. What does that look like for you?
Well, I think it looks like pulling hard on the elastic from opposite directions. I think it doesn't mean that micro contextualist history of thinking in particular places at particular times is not required or is not, is passe. But I think it's no use just doing that without recognizing the need to pull hard from the other direction, which is the humanly ruined globe in which humans are going to have to go on to live if they are, lucky enough to have the option, to retain the option. So, I mean, we have made one hell of a mess. And it's unlikely that artificial intelligence is going to clean it up on our behalf.
Yes. So the work can continue at that more parochial level. I mean, even something like the Cambridge method, attentive to context, that will all continue. It's just that we have to have this more radical imaginative, if I can say, vision of what we're contributing to, which is this global widening of the epistemology available to us. Is that a fair way of characterizing what you're saying?
Yes, it's not quite sufficient, but it's all right. I mean, all of it is correct, if you see what I mean from my point of view. But the missing bit is the political urgency, and the political urgency, I think, comes from the political urgency side is always asking, so what, about the thinking that is being uncovered, as it were, in I don't think much thinking was actually uncovered in Montségur, but wherever the cheese and the worms were. I mean, in a way, all history is micro stories, but it's the juxtaposition of a very large number of micro stories. And politically speaking, now, the juxtaposition needs to try to see and think, sort of unwisely, and feel from both ends, not just from one.
I see.
I gave the talk about Widening global history of political. I give it in another place. I wrote it originally for the Institute of Advanced Studies in Helsinki, but I gave the talk for the opening of the academic year in the law faculty at the University of Tokyo a few years back. And my commentator was the successor to the history of Japanese political thought, a very, very fine scholar called Watanabe Hiroshi, really outstanding person, and quite tough, small but tough. And he said to me three things after I'd finished. He said, first of all, translating is impossible. And then he said, and by the way, if you do manage to translate and you understand what you're translating, which you won't be able to translate it unless you do understand it, you'll find your identity is slipping away from you. Japanese thought. And then he said, and I will now give you a list of Japanese political categories which are untranslatable. And I said, well, you'll have to tell me, so what about them? but on the first point, of course, it's ridiculous to suggest that translation is impossible. It's just a bit rough. And actually, all language works through translation. Radical interpretation. How do you think anyone learns language? And as to my identity slipping away from me, I'm fine with that.
Yes. It's really interesting, John, because one of the things, I mean, you're giving, it seems to me, an explicitly normative role to history. It's concerned with what is to be done in the sense of we're trying to work out how far we can trust each other. I think that's the phrase you use in your article. What would that sort of optimum yet achievable trust look like for you if we were to get as far down the line as possible with this global history?
Well, I think it would, be highly differentiated as life across the globe is. But what I do think is that we live in a world which isn't just a world of giant corporations and smaller corporations and individual economic agents. We live in a world of states, and states are going to have to cope with limiting the ruin of the world, and they're making a poor show of it thus far. And I think Netanyahu attacked Putin for demanding ceasefire in Gaza. I think you shouldn't expect this all to get sweet and well lit in a hurry. You have to ask, what are the directions in which it is urgently necessary to push? And I am a career university teacher, post-career university teacher. But anyway, that's who I am. That's my social identity. And I was a historian. I'm a renegade historian. And as a renegade historian, I didn't want to spend my life just on the past. I didn't ever really understand how you could spend your life just on the past. And I suspect the sincerity of those who believe themselves to be spending their life just on the past. And I actually have a lot of inductive evidence for my suspicion. So, I think there may be an element of confusion or deficient self-knowledge there. But I think, well, what's the point, from my point of view, in being a historian at all? And I've always thought, well, the point of being a historian at all has to be contributing positively to the future. And in this instance, I see, as it were, the need for positive contribution, as I've tried to sketch out, as being very, very large. And you contribute what you can. They won't contribute more than they can, but I see that as being the need. And it's in a way, it is what I've been trying to do in my life. So it's fine for me. Obviously, it wouldn't suit everyone, but lots of people, in a way, don't particularly. This is a finding of political science. A lot of people don't really care much about the future of anyone else, and certainly not the future of anyone else. 75 years out. But actually, I do rather care, because I'm quite, despite its formidable limitations, I find it hard not to care about the human species. And I've got children, and I hope they will have children. I fear what will happen to their children, and that's before we get on to their children. But I want the human future to be less grim than as this point in time I expect it to be. So that's why I'm pushing in the direction I am.
I see. That's very, very interesting and both moving too, John, because I do think as I read you, that is what I find most interesting about your work, is that relationship between history and future-oriented action. You know, you once said, I think it was in the History of Political Theory, in that essay, which was originally published in Italian and then republished in English, that the study of politics, you know, is a profoundly historical study. What does history have to offer us in making sense of politics that other disciplines or way in don't have to offer?
I think history offers a much more satisfactory, yes, I mean, possibility of apprehension than any rival. I just think that if you want to know where you are, you can't really judge what to do unless you do know where you are. And if you want to know where you are, there isn't any rival to history as a cognitive resource. I mean, history can show you where you are. It can't show you a lot of the practical implications of being there, but it can show you where you are.
It's interesting that Edmund Burke has this phrase, which I think is in the East India Company speech, where he says that the situation of man is the preceptor of his duty. So perhaps what history can do is it can show us the situation we are in, and then it's on us to do our thinking for ourselves from that position. Is that a fair characterization of how you see history, you think?
I think that it's a wonderful phrase, and it is sort of consistent with the best about him as a thinking being over time. I think it's definitely right that you can't judge your duty except on the basis of historical apprehension. I think it's not a very didactic preceptor. It doesn't actually show you what to do, because you have to make practical judgments about causality, and history doesn't make those for you, and you have to make them in a way sort of peering into a very, very murky future. I don't mean murky in the sense of discouraging. I mean sort of perceptually, visually very, very restricted, imperfect. So I mean, I think that it's a wonderful phrase of Burke's, and you can sort of unravel most of Burke around that.
Yes, and it's interesting that you used the word self-knowledge before too, John, because the sense I'm getting is that having a sense of the situation you are in requires a sense of self-understanding. And, you know, before you act, how does self-understanding or self-knowledge for you relate to political judgment? If we have to do our thinking for ourselves and work out matters of causality for ourselves in response to our own circumstances, how does self-understanding factor into that? And how does history aid us with that, if it does at all?
Well, I think it aids us a lot in terms of, yes, I mean, I think self-understanding in a completely ahistorical way is conceptually incoherent. I don't think it makes any sense. So I don't think a human being could understand themselves except in some sense through a picture of where they've come from and what they are because of where they've come from. I mean, that is the way in which humans understand themselves to the limited degree that they do. So you can have sort of bits of psychological sort of physiotherapy of a nudge type. And you could say, well, those don't come from history. I mean, they come from a certain kind of very short range psychology. But I mean, you can't, as it were, see where you want to nudge unless you know who you are and what you want. I mean, so you can't actually understand yourself at all, except historically. And I favour, quite a sort of rich sense of understanding of yourself in space and time. I mean, obviously, not everyone is attracted by that possibility, and lots of people, feel that life is much too short to fuss about in that kind of way. But I just think they're wrong. I think it's a mistake. Yes.
And as a final point, John, it was interesting before too that you talked about the global, in relation to the Japanese friend you were speaking to, the globalization of political thinking potentially having our identity slip away. If we slip away into this globalized space, what then happens to our self-understanding? How do we manage the tension that might arise there?
Well, I think you manage it existentially, which is the way you do manage tensions necessarily. I feel, my identity is slipping away from me all my life, if you see what I mean, but slipped in many different directions. And actually, I'm still, more or less myself when I get up in the morning and try and encourage my 6-year-old daughter to get up too, so that she gets to school in time. And I feel like it's constantly replenished identity, but it's both more interesting and it's more sustaining if you are aware of it stretching backwards and sideways. So it's not. I mean, you could think of it as, obviously, my Japanese interlocutor was encouraging me to think of it as a sort of appallingly slippery space or slope even. But actually, I think of this as the way in which people keep their footing on the,
I see.
the sort of moving.
Yes. It might be the most human thing. What did Michael Oakeshott say? We become human, and that might be the process of becoming human. Hey?
Yes, it is. Yeah, Oakeshott is someone I haven't really made proper terms with. I didn't. Despite his making valiant attempts to sort of keep my life on the belt rather than putting more. Anyway.
Yes. Are there any final things you'd like to say on the global or on anything, John? It's been such a fascinating honor for me.
No, I don't have anything else to say. I mean, I've said rather too much already. But thank you very much for your interrogation. And it's interesting for me to try to understand it. And some of the questions you ask are very, very hard questions. And although, none of them has absolutely never occurred to me before in any form at all, actually, it's not easy keeping upright on that moving belt. Some of them definitely made me wobble harder than others.
Well, thank you so much, John. It's what you've done for intellectual history and political thinking on such an imaginative scale is extraordinary. And it's, as a young scholar who's just starting out in history, but who is also interested in the future primarily, this has been a very, very resourceful and interesting conversation for me. So I'm so grateful for your time, John.